Welcome to Shooting Straight with A1F.com. I'm Frank Miniter, the editor-in-chief of the NRA's America's First Freedom. Today we have Charles Cooke with us. Now, Charlie, we're going to talk about something here that is astounding. Our quiet neighbor to the north, as we've always known them, has just gone crazy. And they're not just going after truckers and their bank accounts and all of that. They've also decided to seize, like 1,500 types of very popular semi-automatic rifles from their populace. That's due, according to where they are now, if they follow through. April 30th is when this mandate comes that you either turn them in or they're going to come seize them. First of all, I know you're from England and you've moved and immigrated to the United States. This must be astounding, and I'd like to hear your perspective on first coming from English law to America, but then seeing our Canadian neighbors fall to the same place that I think England already is.
Well, I feel about this the way that I felt about a great deal of the news out of Canada and some of the other Anglosphere nations recently, and that is God bless America, and particularly God bless its Constitution, because that is what sets America apart. There are cultural and political reasons that our gun rights are much safer in America than they are elsewhere, but there's also a Constitution that sits above the government, that the government has to respect. And that doesn't exist in Canada, it doesn't exist in Australia or in Britain. In Britain, Parliament decided that it was going to ban handguns in 1997, so it did it. In 1998, the Australian government decided that it was going to ban huge numbers of firearms, so it did it. And in Canada, it seems, the government has decided, although not in a particularly well thought through way, that it's going to ban the most commonly owned rifles on the market, rifles that would be protected in America under the Heller decision. And so it just did it. In the United States, this would not be possible. In fact, a lot of what the Canadian government has done recently would not be possible. We are protected by the Second Amendment, but also by a lot of other provisions that make gun confiscation difficult. The takings clause, for example, due process provisions, and a system that requires massive buy-in at the federal level from the Senate, from the president, from the House, and so forth. So, I think we should be extremely grateful that we are where we are and recognize what it is that sets us apart.
Right, these rifles are commonly owned in the United States, over 20 million of them, which under the Heller decision makes them constitutionally protected. And of course, have gone both ways on that. But they are commonly owned, so the common use does protect them. I've hunted all over Canada, and in rural Canada, I've always asked the question, what rifles do you own? Are you allowed to own this? You're allowed to own that? And I wasn't surprised, because I know Canadians, to find out they're very much like a lot of rural Americans, or a lot of Americans. They own a lot of semi-automatic rifles, and the AR-15 among them.
Well, I think you've actually hit on the key question here. And in hitting on the key question, you've pointed to one of the other problems, which is the caprice that the Trudeau government has exhibited. This is chaos. They've left 100,000 firearms and their owners in a legal limbo. No one is quite sure. Are they going to be able to keep their guns but not use them? Are they going to be able to keep their guns in a grandfathered state but not lend them to anyone else, not transfer them, not sell them? Are those guns going to be confiscated? Are they going to be reimbursed for those guns but have no choice in selling them to the state? No one seems to know. It seems to me that Trudeau woke up one morning and said, we're going to get rid of what he calls military-style weapons. What are those? Someone gave him a list. He said, let's do it. Then a year later, he took it to Parliament. And that's the other point here. This started off as an executive initiative. He then takes it to Parliament. Parliament says, fine. And then nothing happens. And no one's quite sure where they stand. So while at the moment there is a legal amnesty, that legal amnesty is about to expire. And we should recognize that for what it is. That is a capricious and tyrannical way to treat free people, to leave them unaware of whether they are allowed to keep or use their property, to give them special dispensation to exercise rights that they have exercised for centuries. This is a bizarre way of treating it. And you ask what's going to happen next. I don't know. It seems possible to me that behind the scenes, Trudeau and his government have realized that they've bitten off more than they can chew and that this is a bad idea. It also seems possible that there's going to be chaos come the 30th of April because they're going to try and finish this process without really having thought it through. And once again, I would say, God bless the United States Constitution, because there is just no way that this sort of on the fly thinking could happen in America. Frankly, the policy couldn't happen in America, which is really important. But the on the fly nature of it couldn't happen either.
I don't know. I'm a New Yorker, and in New York State, they have banned what they're calling assault weapons, and the whole when they do call them military arms, I just always shake my head because every type of firearm we own today has been used at some point in time, not just by the military, but often by the U.S. military, and many of them are still owned and are used by militaries. It's just such a strange thing. But I'm in New York State where these guns are banned, and unless you're one of the few people who register them, you're not supposed to have them. And I know a lot of people who do. I still see them at the ranges. Nobody's enforcing that law, but they've decided to ban these in that way. And a few other states have done the same thing. So that also needs to be adjudicated, that this right needs to be taken back even here.
That's true. That's a fair point. Sometimes I fall into the trap of getting too used to Florida, where, where I'm not worried about that at all. But I would say a couple things on that. The first one is that the process in New York, although I think appalling, was a lot more orderly than it has been in Canada because governments have to follow laws, it seems. The second thing is that I think what New York has done is unconstitutional. And I think that at some point, what it has done is going to be struck down. There is no recourse in Canada. There is no chance of that happening. There is nowhere that those people can go to sue. You know, one of the problems that we have with Heller is that the lower courts have ignored it in large part. Almost all of the progress that we've made in restoring the right to keep and bear arms in the last 30 years has come from the people themselves. I mean, you know, at the NRA, this as well as anyone. The people have lobbied their legislators to change the rules. They've told their legislators in Washington and elsewhere, we don't want this sort of legislation. The court has not really struck down very much, and partly because lower courts have declined to intervene, and the Supreme Court has often refused to take cases. I do think that eventually that will change. And I hope when that happens, Frank, that you get some relief in New York State from laws that should never have been put there in the first place.
Right. What it comes down to is Canada doesn't have a Second Amendment.
Right.
It's just that simple and clear. And it doesn't have a National Rifle Association and a lot of strong, in this case, conservative media outlets. I mean, you write a lot for National Review, standing up there and fighting this freedom issue, letting people know this is a freedom issue, so that then grows across the country as it has over the last, or even half century, but certainly the last 2 or 3 decades, as people understand this right and more new gun owners join. It's been incredible to be an American during this period.
Yeah, and there are also an awful lot of Americans in different circumstances who are invested in the right. If you go back to the colonial era, you will find that rural Americans had a slightly higher gun ownership rate than Americans who lived in cities or on the outskirts of cities. But it wasn't that big a difference. And it's just not the case in the United States that the only people who care about gun rights live in rural areas. I mean, Americans are increasingly committed to the Second Amendment. You know, 80% of Americans believe correctly that the right to keep and bear arms is enshrined in the Constitution. The number of Americans who are in favor of draconian gun control keeps dropping, and the number of Americans who own guns keeps rising. And we've seen in the last 2 years an extraordinary increase in gun ownership, and that's happened across all races. It's happened across all regions. It's happened with men and with women. There have been a huge number of first-time gun owners. And I do think in Canada, one of the slight political problems is that there is a really pronounced rural city divide on the question of guns. And if you look back to the gun registry for the Canada tried that you mentioned, that failed. But one of the reasons that it was obvious that it failed is that the Liberal Party, to which Justin Trudeau belongs, was wiped out in Western and rural Canada. Well, there are a lot more gun voters in America than just in the western rural areas. I mean, if we had the equivalent culture, we would only see this show up in, Idaho and Wyoming and Montana and Colorado, but it doesn't. It shows up everywhere. It shows up in Florida. It shows up in North Carolina. It shows up in Texas. It shows up in Wyoming. It shows up in Wisconsin. We do have a much more motivated voting base, and that really ultimately makes a big difference too.
Yeah, it still makes me wonder because I remember interviewing a politician, Canadian politician by the name of Gary Breitkreitz, who fought, and he was surprised. He was voted in a very rural district, and it was just after the gun registry was passed. And he went to his voters and he said, "This is probably a good idea," at a town hall, and they about shouted him out of the room. And he decided to listen to them, and he realized, this is not such a good idea. And then he started to really look at the crime data and who this would be controlling, and the illegal, the criminal element wouldn't be registering their firearms and that sort of thing. And he started to figure out, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. This is about controlling good people. This isn't about stopping criminal behavior. And he became against it, and he led an initiative that then a conservative government run, and he won at the election. So he was able to, he stood up in their parliament and was applauded as they repealed this bill for their gun registry. So Canada did get up at that point in time.
Yes.
They took an election, which gets us back to where we are. We have a Second Amendment that's in place no matter who's in the White House and who runs Congress. The Second Amendment is still there, and hopefully the courts will back that up as they are supposed to do. But Canada just doesn't have that. It can change with each election.
Yep, that's right. The Canadian Parliament is essentially sovereign, as is the case in Australia and in Britain. And when that happens, you don't have anywhere to go if the wrong government gets in. And that happened in Britain in the 90s, in Australia in the 90s. It's now happened in Canada. And once it's happened, it's very, very hard to reverse. Now, I think I've written this for you many times. It's actually extraordinary that the right to keep and bear arms, having been somewhat moribund in the mid-20th century, has been resuscitated the way that it has. That doesn't normally happen. I mean, there's a famous quote from Thomas Jefferson saying, once you lose your liberties, you don't get them back. Well, in this area, Americans did. And that should give them great hope on other constitutional rights that are currently under attack, for example, free speech.
That's true. Rights go away. They don't normally come back, no matter how much the people fight. It's absolutely true. Though we'll see. I would like to see, and I know I'm wishing here, that Canada and other countries will say, look what America has. I mean, the good people will stand up and say, maybe we also need a Second Amendment. Right?
Well, perhaps so.
Not easy, I know. But thank you again, Charles. Again, where can people find you, connect with you?
Well, I write for National Review almost every day, so you can find me there, nationalreview.com. And on Twitter, I'm at Charles C.W. Cooke. And then I have a website at charlescwcooke.com, which has a newsletter that I send out every Saturday.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you for having me.